A police officer humiliates a black woman in court. She shocks the room when she pulls out footage. On a quiet afternoon in Los Angeles, a woman sat peacefully on a park bench, unaware that her life was about to change forever when a police officer approached her. What began as a simple conversation spiraled into a shocking abuse of power that would leave you questioning everything. But what happened next? How did one woman, armed with nothing but her determination and a single piece of evidence, manage to bring a corrupt system to its knees? The sun hung low in the Los Angeles sky, painting the sprawling city with a golden glow. Breonna Jackson, dressed in a sleek, casual navy blouse and fitted jeans, sat on a park bench in Griffith Park, her laptop balanced on her knees. The soft hum of nature blended with distant laughter from children on the playground nearby. It was a peaceful setting, a rare reprieve from her demanding job as a youth counselor. She glanced at her watch, 4:45 p.m. Her friend Michelle had texted earlier to say she would be there by 5 o'clock. Breonna closed her laptop, leaned back, and let herself enjoy the moment, a smile playing on her lips as she watched a jogger chase after their excited golden retriever. Then came the sound, heavy boots crunching on gravel, purposeful and commanding. She barely had time to process the noise before a gruff voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am." Breonna turned her head. A uniformed officer stood over her, his shadow casting a long streak across the bench. His face was taut, his eyes sharp, scrutinizing her as if she were a trespasser in her own city. "Yes," she replied, sitting up straighter. Her tone was polite but guarded. "This area is off limits right now," the officer said, crossing his arms over his chest. The silver name tag gleamed in the sunlight. O'Malley. Breonna frowned, confused. "Off limits? I've been here for nearly an hour, and there's no sign or notice about that." She gestured to the families around the park. "Besides, everyone else is here too." O'Malley's lips curled into a thin smirk. "I wasn't asking for a debate," he snapped. "I said it's off limits. You need to leave." Breonna paused, measuring his tone. Her stomach nodded, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm waiting for a friend, officer. I'll be out of here in 15 minutes. That answer apparently wasn't good enough. O'Malley's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. He stepped closer, the weight of his authority pressing down like a thundercloud. "Listen, lady," he barked. "You're trespassing. You leave now, or I'll have to escort you out myself." The knot in Breonna's stomach tightened, but she refused to let her fear show. "Officer, with all due respect, I'm not trespassing. This is a public park." O'Malley's eyes narrowed. "You're being uncooperative." The jogger with the golden retriever slowed down, glancing at the unfolding scene. A pair of teenagers on bicycles stopped a few yards away, their whispers carrying through the now tense air. Breonna inhaled deeply, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I'm not being uncooperative," she said, her voice firm but steady. "I'm explaining that I have every right to be here." The officer's hand went to his radio. "That's it," he muttered. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for trespassing and failure to comply with a lawful order." The words hit her like a slap. "Arrest? For sitting on a bench? What?" she gasped, rising to her feet. "You can't be serious." O'Malley didn't reply. He grabbed her wrist, his grip tight and unyielding. The onlookers gasped, murmurs rippling through the growing crowd. "Stop resisting," O'Malley growled, though Breonna wasn't resisting. She stumbled under the force of his grip as he yanked her arms behind her back. "Please, this isn't right," Breonna pleaded, her voice shaking now. "You don't have to do this." "Then maybe you should have listened when I told you to leave," O'Malley snarled. He cuffed her wrists tightly, the cold steel biting into her skin. One of the teenagers pulled out a phone and began recording. Another person called out, "Hey, she didn't do anything. Leave her alone." O'Malley turned his glare, silencing the crowd. "Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstruction," he barked. He snatched at the teenager's phone, but the boy darted back, clutching it protectively. Breonna blinked back tears of humiliation as O'Malley shoved her toward the patrol car. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and her chest burned with frustration and shame. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being paraded like a criminal. Before O'Malley shoved her into the back seat, she turned to the crowd, her voice trembling but resolute. "Please," she said, "don't let this go unnoticed. Someone needs to tell the truth." As the car door slammed shut, Breonna's heart sank, but a small, stubborn spark of hope flickered inside her. She wasn't going to let this end here. The courtroom was colder than Breonna expected, both in temperature and atmosphere. The walls, painted a muted beige, were lined with stiff wooden benches filled with spectators. The air buzzed with hushed conversations, the faint rustle of papers, and the occasional clicking of heels on the polished floor. Brianna sat at the defense table, her fingers clasped tightly together on the smooth mahogany surface. Her wrists still ached from the handcuffs that had been cruelly tightened 2 days prior. Her lawyer, Marcus Fleming, a sharp-dressed man in his mid-40s, leaned toward her. His salt and pepper hair reflected the sterile overhead lights as he murmured, "Stay calm. Let them dig their own grave. The truth always comes out." Brianna nodded stiffly, though calm was the last thing she felt. Her heart thudded in her chest like a hammer striking iron. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, some curious, others judgmental. The spectators didn't know her, but she could feel their assumptions, their silent appraisals. Across the room, Sergeant Mark O'Malley sat with his lawyer, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He leaned back in his chair, exuding the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His uniform was immaculate, the badges on his chest gleaming like trophies, and his posture was that of someone who had done this before and emerged unscathed. The bailiff announced, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Eleanor Preston presiding. Brianna stood, her knees stiff, as the judge entered. Judge Preston was a petite woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes and a demeanor that demanded respect. Her black robe flowed as she ascended to the bench, her sharp gaze sweeping over the courtroom before settling briefly on Brianna. "You may be seated," the judge said, her voice firm yet composed. The proceedings began with O'Malley's attorney, a polished man named Patrick Donovan, striding confidently to the front. He spoke with the practiced ease of someone used to controlling narratives. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case," Donovan began, glancing at the jury with a practiced smile. "My client, Sergeant O'Malley, was enforcing the law when he encountered the defendant, Ms. Jackson, trespassing in a restricted area of Griffith Park. Despite repeated warnings, Ms. Jackson refused to leave and actively resisted arrest." Brianna's stomach twisted as Donovan's words filled the room. They were lies, spun with a veneer of professionalism. Marcus Fleming stood when it was his turn, buttoning his jacket with a calm, deliberate motion. "Your Honor, this case is about more than alleged trespassing. It's about abuse of authority. The evidence will show that my client was not trespassing, nor was she resisting arrest. She was targeted, humiliated, and treated unjustly by an officer who overstepped his bounds." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "Proceed with opening statements." When O'Malley took the stand, his arrogance was palpable. He swore to tell the truth, but his demeanor made a mockery of the oath. He sat with his back straight, his hands folded in his lap, answering questions with rehearsed confidence. "Sergeant O'Malley," Donovan began, "can you walk us through the events of April 12th? O'Malley nodded. "Of course. I was conducting routine patrols when I noticed Ms. Jackson loitering in a restricted area of Griffith Park. I informed her that the area was off limits and asked her to leave. She refused, became argumentative, and when I attempted to escort her out, she resisted. At that point, I had no choice but to detain her." His tone was matter of fact, as though he were recounting a mundane traffic stop. "And did Ms. Jackson comply with your lawful orders at any point?" Donovan asked. "No, she did not," O'Malley replied. "She was combative and refused to cooperate." Brianna's jaw clenched. The audacity of his lies was almost unbearable. She glanced at the jury, searching their faces for a glimmer of doubt, but most of them seemed engrossed in O'Malley's testimony. When Marcus rose to cross-examine, his tone was calm, but his words were sharp. "Sergeant O'Malley, you stated that Ms. Jackson was in a restricted area. Can you clarify where the signage indicated this restriction was located?" O'Malley hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "There was a sign at the entrance to the park." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "At the entrance? Are you aware that Griffith Park has multiple entrances spanning several miles?" O'Malley shifted in his seat. "Well, yes, but there are signs posted throughout the park. Were there any signs within visible range of where Ms. Jackson was sitting?" Marcus pressed. O'Malley's jaw tightened. "I can't recall." Marcus didn't let up. "So you can't confirm that Ms. Jackson had any reason to believe she was in a restricted area?" O'Malley glared at Marcus, his composure slipping. "She should have known." Marcus paused, letting the silence stretch. "I see. And you mentioned that she resisted arrest. Could you describe her resistance?" She pulled away when I tried to cuff her, O'Malley said defensively. Marcus nodded, pacing slowly. Pulled away? Did she hit you? Yell? Attempt to flee? No. O'Malley admitted, his voice tight. So she wasn't violent? She wasn't running? And yet you felt it necessary to arrest her? Marcus's voice was sharp now, slicing through the officer's flimsy narrative. O'Malley's face darkened, but he didn't respond. As O'Malley stepped down from the stand, Brianna felt the attention in the room shift. The jury was no longer fully captivated by his story. Doubt was creeping in, but it wasn't enough. Marcus leaned toward Brianna and whispered, "Not yet, but we're getting there." Brianna nodded, her heart still pounding. The truth was her only weapon, and she clung to it desperately, waiting for her moment to reveal it. The footage in her possession was more than evidence. It was her lifeline, her salvation. The court adjourned for a brief recess, but the battle was far from over. The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating as the recess ended. The spectators returned to their seats, murmuring softly among themselves. Brianna sat at the defense table, her hands resting on her lap, though her fingers trembled slightly. She clenched them tightly, willing herself to remain composed. Marcus leaned over, his voice calm but firm. "This is where it all changes, Brianna. Stay strong and let the evidence speak for itself." She nodded, but the weight of what was to come bore down on her. This was her chance to shatter O'Malley's lies, to prove her innocence. But as she glanced across the room at him, sitting smugly next to his attorney, she felt the familiar sting of humiliation bubbling up. She pushed it down, focusing on her goal. "Ms. Jackson, please take the stand," the bailiff announced. She rose, smoothing her navy blazer as she walked to the witness stand. The sound of her heels against the polished floor echoed in the silent room. As she raised her hand to swear the oath, her heart raced, but her voice was steady as she promised to tell the truth. Marcus stood, his demeanor confident yet approachable. "Ms. Jackson, can you describe what happened on the day in question?" Brianna took a deep breath and began. "I was sitting on a bench in Griffith Park, waiting for a friend. I had my laptop with me, and I was answering emails while enjoying the scenery. It was a normal day, peaceful, until Sergeant O'Malley approached me." She paused, glancing at the jury. Some leaned forward slightly, their faces attentive. "He told me I was trespassing in a restricted area," she continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I looked around, confused, because there were no signs or barriers anywhere near me. Families were playing, people were jogging. It was a public park." Marcus nodded. "And how did you respond?" "I told him I was waiting for a friend and would leave shortly," she said. But he wasn't interested in listening. He insisted I leave immediately and started raising his voice. I tried to explain myself, but he accused me of being uncooperative. Marcus took a step closer to the jury box, his voice firm. "Did you ever resist him, Miss Jackson?" "No," she said firmly. "I stayed seated until he grabbed my wrist and forced me to stand. He handcuffed me in front of everyone, accusing me of resisting when I wasn't doing anything but asking why I was being detained." Her voice cracked slightly, and she looked down for a moment, collecting herself. As Brianna finished recounting her testimony, Marcus glanced toward the judge. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, the defense would like to present new evidence." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Marcus turned to the court's projector and retrieved a USB drive from his briefcase. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is footage taken from Ms. Jackson's personal GoPro camera, which was in her possession at the time of the incident. It captures the events exactly as they occurred." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. O'Malley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smug expression faltering. Donovan shot up from his chair. "Your Honor, this evidence has not been submitted prior to today. We object to its inclusion." Marcus cut him off smoothly. "Your Honor, the prosecution cannot claim surprise. The footage was retained by my client after Sergeant O'Malley unlawfully attempted to confiscate all recordings at the scene. We are prepared to authenticate the footage immediately." Judge Preston considered this for a moment, her piercing gaze moving between the two lawyers. Finally, she nodded. "I'll allow it. Proceed." The courtroom fell silent as Marcus inserted the USB into the laptop connected to the projector. The screen flickered to life, displaying a clear, wide-angle view of Griffith Park. The footage began with Brianna sitting on the bench, her laptop open. The soft sounds of children playing could be heard in the background. O'Malley's voice broke through, suddenly sharp and commanding. "Excuse me, ma'am. This area is off limits." The jury watched as the scene unfolded exactly as Brianna had described. her calm yet confused responses, O'Malley's escalating aggression, and finally, the moment he grabbed her wrist, twisting it roughly behind her back. But it was what came next that sent shock waves through the room. O'Malley could be heard muttering under his breath as he cuffed her. Always causing trouble. Can't ever follow the rules, can you? The courtroom erupted in gasps. O'Malley visibly paled, his hand clenching the edge of the table. The footage continued, showing a bystander stepping forward with their phone. O'Malley turned on them, shoving the phone out of their hand and threatening arrest. Marcus paused the video. Your Honor, this footage speaks for itself. It directly contradicts Sergeant O'Malley's testimony and exposes his misconduct. The jury was visibly shaken. Some exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. The spectators whispered among themselves, their murmurs filling the room. O'Malley's attorney scrambled to regain control. Your Honor, this footage is unverified. The defense has already offered to authenticate it. Marcus interrupted. And if the prosecution has any doubt, I'd like to call a bystander who recorded the same incident. A man in the back of the courtroom stood. He was holding a phone. I still have my video, he said loudly. The judge's gavel struck. Order in the court. But the damage was done. O'Malley sat rigid, his face pale and his smug confidence shattered. As the court recessed for the day, Brianna returned to her seat, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. Marcus leaned close, a small, triumphant smile on his face. We've got him, Brianna, he whispered. She nodded, her heart still pounding. For the first time since this nightmare began, hope felt tangible, solid. The truth was out, and O'Malley's carefully constructed facade was crumbling before everyone's eyes. But Brianna knew this wasn't over, not yet. Justice was on the horizon, but she wasn't going to let her guard down, not until O'Malley faced the consequences of his actions. The following morning, the courtroom buzzed with subdued anticipation. Spectators filled the benches early, eager to witness the unraveling of the case that had gripped the city. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the weight of what had been revealed the day before. The footage had shifted the scales, but no one dared predict the outcome with certainty. Brianna sat at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the surface. Though her outward demeanor was calm, a storm of emotions churned within her, nervousness, anger, and a flickering ember of hope. She glanced at Marcus, who was meticulously reviewing his notes, the corner of his mouth set in a faint, reassuring smile. On the other side of the courtroom, Sergeant O'Malley sat rigid, his jaw clenched. Gone was the smug confidence of the previous days. His attorney, Patrick Donovan, whispered furiously in his ear, but O'Malley seemed too consumed by his own thoughts to respond. The judge entered the courtroom, her presence silencing the murmur instantly. She adjusted her glasses, her sharp eyes sweeping over the room. Court is now in session, she declared. Marcus rose. Your Honor, the defense would like to call one final witness to the stand, a bystander who recorded the events in question. A man in his early 30s, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, stepped forward. His name was Kenneth Moore, and he had been one of the onlookers at Griffith Park. He swore the oath and settled into the witness chair, his posture stiff but resolute. Mr. Moore, Marcus began. Can you describe what you witnessed on the day in question? Kenneth nodded. I was at Griffith Park with my girlfriend. We were sitting near the playground when I noticed Officer O'Malley approach Miss Jackson. At first, it seemed like a routine interaction, but then his tone changed. He got aggressive, and it was clear he wasn't listening to her. And what did you do? Marcus prompted. I started recording on my phone, Kenneth said, holding up the device. I've still got the video. Marcus approached the bench, addressing the judge. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to present Mr. Moore's recording as corroborating evidence. Judge Preston gestured for him to proceed. Let's see it. The video played on the courtroom's projector, offering another angle of the incident. It captured Brianna seated on the bench, her voice calm as she explained her presence. O'Malley's escalating aggression was evident, his tone laced with frustration and disdain. The most damning moment came when Kenneth's camera captured O'Malley muttering under his breath, unaware he was being recorded. These people always think the rules don't apply to them. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. O'Malley's face turned crimson, and Donovan buried his head in his hands. Kenneth's voice on the video cut through the tension. Why are you treating her like this? She didn't do anything wrong. The footage showed O'Malley turning toward the camera, his expression twisted with anger. He reached for Kenneth's phone, barking, "Stop recording, or you're next." The video ended with the sound of O'Malley muttering something unintelligible as he handcuffed Brianna and led her away. Donovan stood, visibly rattled. "Your Honor, this video lacks proper authentication." Judge Preston raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough, Mr. Donovan. The footage is consistent with the previous evidence submitted by the defense. Your objection is noted but overruled." Brianna exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing ever so slightly. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of shock and disapproval. O'Malley's narrative had crumbled, and the weight of the truth hung heavily in the air. The judge straightened in her chair, her expression stern as she addressed the courtroom. "I've seen enough to make a preliminary judgment." She turned to Brianna. "Ms. Jackson, the evidence presented has exonerated you of all charges. It is clear that you were unjustly targeted and detained. The court apologizes for the undue stress and harm this ordeal has caused you." Brianna's chest swelled with relief, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Judge Preston's gaze shifted to O'Malley, her voice cold and unyielding. "As for Sergeant O'Malley, this court cannot ignore the blatant abuse of power and racial prejudice evident in his actions. I am referring this case to the Los Angeles Police Department's Internal Affairs Division for a full investigation into his conduct. Additionally, I am recommending the district attorney pursue charges of misconduct and unlawful detainment." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the crowd struggling to process the weight of the judge's words. O'Malley sat motionless, his face drained of color. "Order," the judge demanded, her gavel striking the wood. As the court adjourned, reporters swarmed the hallways outside, their cameras flashing. Brianna, overwhelmed by the attention, stayed close to Marcus as he guided her through the throng. "You did it," he whispered as they reached a quiet corner. "You stood up for yourself, and the truth won." Brianna nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, or without everyone who refused to stay silent." As she stepped out into the sunlight, the crowd parted to let her pass. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight on her shoulders lift. Justice wasn't just a distant concept. It was something she had fought for and won. But even as the day ended, she knew this was only the beginning. There were others like her, silenced by power and fear, and now, armed with her victory, she was determined to be a voice for them all. The headlines hit the streets within hours of the verdict. "Los Angeles officer under fire for racial misconduct," blared across the front pages of the Los Angeles Times, while national networks like CNN aired segments dissecting the case. The footage of O'Malley's actions went viral, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. By nightfall, the city's police department was in full damage control mode, scrambling to address the fallout. Brianna sat in her modest living room, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls, texts, and notifications. She had turned off most of her social media accounts to escape the overwhelming deluge of attention. Her focus was elsewhere, on the larger picture, the justice she hoped to see unfold. Marcus sat across from her, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. His tie was loosened, and the weariness of the past few weeks showed in his posture, but his eyes were alight with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "They're going to drag him through the mud," he said, setting the cup down. "Internal Affairs won't be able to ignore this, not with the public watching so closely." Brianna nodded, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "It's not just about him," she said softly. "It's about the system that let him get away with this for so long." The following week, O'Malley stood before a disciplinary review board at the Los Angeles Police Department. Gone was the polished uniform and air of arrogance. He now wore a cheap suit, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the evidence stacked against him. The footage from the trial was played again, this time for his peers. The room was silent as his colleagues, officers, detectives, and commanders watched the undeniable proof of his misconduct. Sergeant O'Malley, the lead investigator from Internal Affairs, began, her tone icy. "You are facing charges of racial discrimination, abuse of power, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. How do you plead?" O'Malley's voice, once commanding, was now subdued. "Not guilty," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room. The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Not guilty? Despite the video evidence, eyewitness accounts, and your own incriminating statements. I was just doing my job," O'Malley said, his voice rising defensively. She was being uncooperative. "Enough." The investigator cut him off, her voice sharp. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to humiliate and target civilians based on prejudice." Your actions have disgraced this department and eroded public trust. O'Malley opened his mouth to argue, but the investigator raised a hand to silence him. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending termination proceedings. Additionally, this case will be referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. O'Malley slumped in his chair, the weight of his downfall finally sinking in. Brianna's civil lawsuit against the city moved swiftly, bolstered by the overwhelming evidence from the trial. Marcus guided her through the process, ensuring her voice was heard every step of the way. During the settlement hearing, representatives from the city sat across from Brianna and Marcus, their expressions strained. They offered an initial settlement of $500,000, but Marcus didn't flinch. My client deserves more than a token gesture, he said firmly. This isn't just about money, it's about accountability. After hours of negotiation, the city agreed to a $2 million settlement, accompanied by a public apology from the mayor's office. When the news broke, Brianna received messages of support from community leaders, advocacy groups, and even strangers who had followed her story. The apology, while symbolic, carried weight. It was a small step toward justice, but a meaningful one nonetheless. As O'Malley's misconduct came to light, other complaints against him began to surface. Former colleagues and civilians came forward with stories of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. A retired officer appeared on a local news segment, his face tight with anger. We reported him to our superiors more than once, he said, but nothing ever came of it. The system protected him. Protests erupted outside police headquarters, demanding systemic reform. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling" filled the streets. Brianna attended one of the protests, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. A young woman approached her, holding a small handmade sign. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling, "for standing up to him, for standing up for all of us." Brianna smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. Months later, Brianna was leaving a community center where she had started volunteering, using part of her settlement money to fund legal aid workshops for marginalized groups. As she walked to her car, she spotted a familiar figure standing by the entrance. O'Malley. He was dressed in a cheap security guard uniform. His shoulders slumped as he scanned the parking lot. For a moment, their eyes met, and Brianna saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but the weight of his shame kept him silent. Brianna felt a surge of emotions, anger, pity, and a deep sense of vindication. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving him to grapple with the consequences of his actions. The case became a turning point in Los Angeles, sparking citywide reforms within the police department. New training programs on racial sensitivity and de-escalation tactics were implemented, and a civilian oversight committee was established to ensure accountability. Brianna's name became synonymous with resilience and justice. She continued her work as a youth counselor, but her focus expanded to include advocacy for systemic change. She spoke at schools, community events, and even national conferences, sharing her story and inspiring others to stand up for what was right. Justice, Brianna realized, wasn't just about one victory in a courtroom. It was about creating a ripple effect, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. And as she stood before a room full of young people at one of her workshops, she said the words that had carried her through her darkest days. The truth doesn't lie, and when you stand up for it, you stand up for everyone who's been silenced. The weeks following the lawsuit and public reckoning had been a whirlwind for Brianna. Life was quieter now, though the echoes of her case still reverberated through the city. Griffith Park, the place where her ordeal had begun, became a symbol of resilience. Community groups gathered there to celebrate victories against injustice, their voices filling the air with songs of hope. Brianna had avoided the park since the incident. She told herself it was because she was busy with her advocacy work, but deep down, she knew it was something else. The park still held the weight of that day, the humiliation, the fear, the doubt that had threatened to crush her. But today was different. The air was crisp, the sky painted with the soft pastels of an early sunset. As Brianna parked her car near the entrance, she stepped out, clutching a small notebook to her chest. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate as she made her way to the bench where it all began. When she reached it, she paused. The bench looked the same, but the moment felt entirely different. This time, she wasn't sitting in fear or waiting for someone to save her. She was here on her terms, with her head held high. Brianna sat down, letting the cool metal of the bench ground her. She opened her notebook, filled with scribbled ideas for her next project, a community initiative aimed at creating legal clinics for underprivileged neighborhoods. As she flipped through the pages, a small group of children ran past her, laughing and chasing each other. Their joy filled the air, momentarily lifting the heaviness in her chest. "Brianna?" The voice startled her, pulling her back to the present. She turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, clutching a stroller. The woman's face was familiar, and Brianna's mind raced to place her. It clicked. Michelle, the friend she had been waiting for on the day of her arrest. "Michelle," Brianna said, rising to her feet. The two women embraced, their hug lingering as the weight of unspoken words passed between them. "I've been trying to reach you," Michelle said, her voice tinged with regret. "I saw everything on the news. I should have been there that day." "You couldn't have known," Brianna interrupted gently. "And you're here now. That's what matters." Michelle nodded, her eyes misty. "You've been incredible, Brianna. The way you stood up, the way you fought back. You've inspired so many people." Brianna smiled, though her chest tightened with the memory of how difficult it had been. "I just did what I had to. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." The two women sat on the bench, the stroller parked beside them. Michelle's toddler babbled happily, unaware of the weight of the conversation. "Do you ever think about that day?" Michelle asked after a long silence. "All the time," Brianna admitted, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It was one of the worst days of my life, but it also changed everything. I learned how strong I could be, how much I could endure, and I realized that speaking up wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's ever been silenced." Michelle reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than anyone I know." Brianna turned to her friend, her eyes steady. "Strength isn't just standing up. It's knowing when to lean on others too. I couldn't have done this alone." As the sun dipped lower, Brianna noticed a group gathering nearby. It was a small rally organized by a local civil rights group. A speaker stood on a makeshift stage, addressing the crowd with passion. One of the organizers spotted Brianna and waved her over. "Ms. Jackson, would you like to say a few words?" Brianna hesitated, but Michelle nudged her gently. "Go on. You've got this." Taking a deep breath, Brianna walked toward the stage. The crowd parted to let her pass, their faces lighting up with recognition. She climbed the steps slowly, her heart pounding as she took the microphone. She looked out at the crowd, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "I'm not here as a hero or a savior," she began. "I'm just someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time and who refused to stay silent when it mattered most." The crowd nodded, their energy palpable. "What happened to me shouldn't have happened to anyone," she continued. "And the fact that it did shows how much work we still have to do. But we can't lose hope. Every voice matters. Every step forward, no matter how small, matters." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. The fight for justice isn't easy. It's messy, painful, and often exhausting. But it's worth it. Because when we stand together, when we refuse to back down, we can change the world. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers ringing out across the park. Brianna stepped back from the microphone, her chest heaving with emotion. As the rally continued, Brianna returned to the bench. She sat quietly, letting the warmth of the applause wash over her. For the first time since that fateful day, she felt a sense of closure. The scars from her experience would never fully fade, but they had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who could stand in the face of injustice and fight back. And as she watched the sun disappear behind the trees, she realized that Griffith Park no longer felt like a place of pain. It was a place of transformation, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. She closed her notebook and stood, ready to face whatever came next. For Brianna Jackson, the fight for justice was far from over, but she knew deep in her heart that she was ready. The weeks after Brianna's speech at the rally were filled with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. She was no longer just the woman who had endured injustice. She was a symbol of resistance and resilience. But symbols came with responsibilities, and Brianna was determined not to let those who believed in her down. Her newly founded initiative, the Justice for All Project, was gaining traction. The nonprofit aimed to provide legal aid to marginalized communities and educate people about their rights. Every morning, as she walked into the modest office space that served as the organization's headquarters, she was greeted by the sight of volunteers bustling about, young lawyers, activists, and community members who had been inspired by her story. Despite the progress, Brianna often found herself reflecting on how far they still had to go. The calls and emails pouring in from people across the city were a constant reminder that her case was just one in a sea of injustices. One day, as Brianna sorted through a stack of letters in her office, her assistant Leah knocked on the door. "Brianna, there's someone here to see you," Leah said, her voice tinged with urgency. "Who is it?" Brianna asked, glancing up from her desk. "It's a woman named Maria Vargas. She says her son was recently arrested unfairly by the LAPD, and she doesn't know what to do." Brianna's heart tightened. It wasn't the first time someone had come to her with a story like this, but each one hit her with the same weight. "Send her in," Brianna said, standing to greet the woman. Maria entered hesitantly, clutching a small, worn purse. Her eyes were red from crying, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her despair. "Ms. Jackson," Maria began, her voice trembling, "I don't know where else to turn. My son, Santiago, was arrested 2 days ago for something he didn't do. They say he resisted arrest, but all he did was ask why they were stopping him." Brianna gestured for Maria to sit, her voice gentle but firm. "Tell me everything," she said, grabbing a notebook. As Maria recounted the events, the parallels to Brianna's own experience were undeniable. Santiago, a bright college student, had been walking home when officers stopped him without explanation. When he asked why, things escalated quickly, and he was thrown to the ground and handcuffed. Brianna listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across the page. When Maria finished, tears streaming down her face, Brianna leaned forward and placed a reassuring hand on hers. "We're going to help you," Brianna said firmly. "I promise." The following days were a flurry of activity. Brianna and her team gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and reached out to local organizations for support. Marcus, now one of the Justice for All Project's lead attorneys, spearheaded the legal strategy. Late one evening, Brianna sat in her office, reviewing the footage that a bystander had captured of Santiago's arrest. Her stomach churned as she watched the grainy video. The scene was all too familiar. The aggressive tone of the officers, the unnecessary use of force, and the look of confusion and fear on Santiago's face. A knock at her door startled her. Marcus stepped in, his tie loosened and a folder in his hand. "How's it looking?" he asked, gesturing to the laptop. "Damning," Brianna replied, her voice heavy. "It's the same story, Marcus. Over and over again." Marcus sat down across from her, his expression somber. "It's exhausting, I know, but you're making a difference, Brianna. You're giving people hope." She nodded, though the weight of the fight felt heavier than ever. The courtroom was packed on the day of Santiago's hearing. The media had picked up on the case, and Brianna's involvement had drawn significant attention. Maria sat in the front row, clutching a tissue and whispering prayers under her breath. Brianna sat beside her, her presence a quiet reassurance. Marcus presented the evidence with the precision of a seasoned attorney. The footage, coupled with testimonies from witnesses, painted a clear picture of racial profiling and abuse of power. When the lead officer in the case took the stand, he faltered under cross-examination. Marcus's questions were sharp and unrelenting, exposing inconsistencies in the officer's report. By the time the defense rested, the room was buzzing with anticipation. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, called for a recess before delivering his verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge returned. His face was stern, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Santiago. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, "It is clear that Mr. Vargas was unlawfully detained," the judge declared. "The charges against him are dismissed, and this court recommends an investigation into the conduct of the arresting officer." Maria broke into sobs, clutching Brianna's hand tightly. Santiago, who had been sitting beside his attorney, buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed with relief. Brianna felt a swell of emotion as the crowd erupted into applause. This was why she fought, so that families like Maria's wouldn't have to endure the pain and fear she had once known. In the weeks that followed, Santiago's case became another rallying cry for change. The Justice for All project gained even more support, its mission resonating with people across the city. Brianna continued to work tirelessly, but she also began to see the ripple effects of her efforts. People were standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept the status quo. One evening, as Brianna left the office, she paused to look at the city skyline. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, She felt the weight of hope pressing against the heaviness in her heart. And as she walked into the night, she carried with her the unwavering belief that change, though slow and often painful, was always possible. The sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet as Brianna stepped out of the courthouse. The crisp evening air carried a sense of finality, a quiet assurance that the tides of justice were slowly, but surely, turning. The sounds of the city buzzed around her, but she felt a rare stillness within, a peace she hadn't known in years. Santiago and his mother, Maria, walked alongside her, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and gratitude. The young man had been cleared of all charges, and the officers responsible for his wrongful arrest were now under investigation. For Brianna, the victory was more than just a personal triumph. It was proof that change was possible, even in a system that seemed designed to resist it. Later that evening, Brianna found herself back at her small apartment. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was home. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks filled with ideas for the Justice for All project. A steaming cup of chamomile tea sat nearby, untouched. The sound of her phone vibrating broke the silence. It was a message from Marcus. "Great work today. Rest up. You've earned it." Brianna smiled and set the phone down. The weight of exhaustion pulled at her, but she couldn't rest just yet. She opened her notebook to a blank page, her pen hovering over it. "What's next?" she whispered to herself. The next morning, Brianna stood on the steps of Griffith Park's community center. It was the site of a new program she had spearheaded, free legal workshops for underserved communities. Families, young professionals, and students filled the room inside, eager to learn about their rights and how to navigate the legal system. Brianna watched as volunteers greeted attendees, handing out pamphlets and answering questions. She had dreamed of this moment, but seeing it come to life was something else entirely. A woman approached her, holding the hand of a young boy. "Ms. Jackson," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you've done, it gives people like us hope." Brianna knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Caleb," he replied shyly. "Well, Caleb," Brianna said with a warm smile, "don't ever forget you can be anything you want to be. And if anyone ever tells you otherwise, you fight back, okay?" Caleb nodded, his eyes wide with admiration. As the woman and her son walked away, Brianna felt a swell of pride. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was helping to build a foundation for future generations. That evening, Brianna returned to the bench at Griffith Park. The soft hum of the city mingled with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She sat quietly, watching the world move around her. In her mind, she replayed the journey that had brought her here, the humiliation, the fear, the anger, and finally, the triumph. She hadn't chosen the battle, but it had revealed a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. LAPD announces sweeping reforms following high-profile misconduct cases. Brianna stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. It wasn't the end of the fight, not by a long shot, but it was a step forward. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something powerful, a drive to keep pushing for change. As the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, Brianna stood and took one last look at the park. It was no longer a place of pain for her. It was a symbol of transformation. She walked away with her head high, ready to face whatever came next. For Brianna Jackson, the fight for justice was no longer just her battle. It was a movement, a legacy, and a promise to those who would come after her. The truth doesn't lie, and justice will always find its way. Brianna's story is a powerful reminder that even in the face of injustice, courage and determination can ignite real change. One woman's fight for truth became a spark that inspired a movement, proving that no voice is too small to make an impact.